All right, everybody, take a seat. We got people online and they're waiting. We have more online than we do in person. So let's go.
State of the world these days. Oh, it's on.
Well, welcome to our annual members program for 2025. I've got three incredibly illustrious speakers with us. What do you think they all have in common, besides the fact that they're experts on China? They are all public intellectuals of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. So this is, we just had our members meeting, and I was talking about the next generation. And this program is all about the next generation. It's all about folks who were terrific and are fellows of our public intellectuals program, and now are doing exactly what you're supposed to do as a public intellectual, which is talk to the American people. And we hope this program is viewed by hundreds of thousands. Alison, I'm not gonna go over their full bios. I'm just gonna give the one sentence summary of what they're doing. She's the James and Susan Mosher Executive and Artistic Director for the Carolina Performing Arts at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And you started that in 2021. Andrew Polk is the co-founder and the head of economic research at Trivium China, a strategic advisory forum, in case you didn't know what it was. And then Jessica Chen Weiss, who is the David Lambton Professor of China Studies. David Lambton is in the audience at Johns Hopkins University SAIS and non-resident senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis. And I can tell you, I have read all of their stuff, and it is well worth reading. The elephant in the room today is tariffs. So let me start with Andrew and say, gosh, this has been a roller coaster. I'm not asking you to predict, well, I may ask you to say, to predict where this is going to end up, but where has it kind of taken us and what has it done to the U.S. China relationship?
Yeah, well, thanks, Steve, for having me. It's good to know I'm part of the next generation because I'm feeling very old these days, doing my work on China and U.S. China, but I mean, partly because of tariffs. I mean, obviously, when we talk about the recent, it's hard to even talk about the recent mechanism that just happened because it wasn't a deal. I'm always tempted to call it a deal. It was a ceasefire, into current hostilities. Obviously, we have 90 days to go. I mean, I think the big thing from China's side is that they've just been preparing for this for, really for about 10 years, but especially since the end of the second Trump administration, to see this, kick back up. And in my view, just thinking about from the China side, they've taken a very much more disciplined approach than they did last time around. The last time around, they were hitting back. You could tell they were sort of building the plane as they were flying. But this time, they had a very clear plan. They've stuck to what they wanted to do, which was not just hit back on tariffs, but build out these other pieces of the toolkit so that they could have basically some leverage to pull things off when and if a negotiation started to happen, like the rare earths export controls, like the unreliable entity listings, et cetera. And so I think from their point of view, they've put themselves in a place where they're pretty happy, and I think they feel vindicated by where we are at this point. Where we go from here, obviously, is anybody's guess, but I think, this is, China's under no illusions that, that even when and if a negotiation, a successful negotiation takes place, that this will be the end of the story in increased sort of coercion from the U.S. towards China. So, I mean, it's obviously, played a big role in the ongoing deterioration of U.S.-China relations, in our view, and will likely continue to.
What have they done to prepare? And what can they do more if tariffs come back to this incredible level?
Well, I mean, first of all, they've tried to shore up their economy to some extent. Obviously, the Chinese economy has huge challenges. They're trying to, reduce the exposure of their exporters to the U.S., which they've done pretty successfully. They've also tried to diversify away from key U.S. imports, like in agriculture and resources. And then, like I said, they've built up this incredible and seemingly effective lawfare toolkit with really, at this point, we thought it was the anti-foreign sanctions law that was going to be the centerpiece. Then the UEL came along, and it seemed like that might be it, but they very clearly put export controls front and center, which they've kind of realized is the name of the game since the October 2022 export controls that the Biden administration put on semiconductors. And so they've just built out these capabilities where they can have leverage and sort of press that leverage or ease off on that leverage as appropriate, which they've done, again, with the rare earths piece. Rare earths are now still under export controls, but they've just decided to effectively grant license for those controls under the 90-day pause. If the 90-day pause doesn't work out in a more successful negotiation, they can just stop issuing the licenses or revoke the licenses for sales to U.S. companies.
So a bunch of companies in the U.S. are raising prices, and we're at a basic tariff rate of 30% currently. Mm-hmm. Is that fair? Mm-hmm. You know, obviously, certain things are exempted, and it gets all messy. At what level do we just decouple? Do Chinese goods become simply unsaleable in the United States?
I mean, we're going to test that thesis, I think, so we think the elasticities are a little bit lower, that people actually, U.S. companies are, will continue to buy more Chinese goods, even at relatively high tariff rates than sort of most people think. But, I mean, the current tariff rates, we always remind our people internally about this. I mean, we've added 30%. The tariff rates aren't at 30%, they're at about 50%. So we are absolutely going to see it's still an embargo level for some goods, and then we have actual embargoes on other goods through other means, for example, in EVs. So I still don't see a full-scale decoupling. We'll see what the Trump administration does. I think, obviously, a lot of people in the markets are still pretty optimistic that there will be a significant climb down. But the thesis about whether or not we're going to decouple is certainly going to be tested. I think we'll likely decouple in some areas where, buyers in the U.S. and producers in China can find other suppliers or other in demand.
Jessica, so Chinese talk about the emergence of a multipolar world and changes unseen in a century. Is this what they mean? That these tariffs, which are basically shutting off the United States from China, coupled with all these export restrictions and everything else, how do the Chinese really see this?
Well, as I think Andrew said, I think this was anticipated, and I think some of this is bound up in this phrase, changes unseen in a century, which I think really refers to changes in the willingness of dominant powers to lead and uphold the system that they once built in the United States, but also referring to Brexit, which is reflecting this sort of inward turn fueled by nationalism, a turn against, to some extent, globalization. And I think that the phrase, the emergence of a multipolar world, is one in which China feels, relatively respected and secure, rather than constantly subject to the potential for strangulation or containment by the United States. That's not just materially preponderant, but also kind of more dominant ideologically in terms of the pressure that's been put on the Chinese Communist Party, which certainly doesn't want to see itself as ending up on kind of the ash heap of history. So they certainly welcome, I think, changes in U.S. rhetoric from the president himself, suggesting that we will no longer lecture other countries on how to live. But I certainly don't think that there was a desire to see this, kind of full-throated trade war. So I mean, I think, changes unseen in a century, I think, refers to both risks and opportunities, and I see those kind of very much out in full force.
When you were in the State Department, the Biden administration kind of saw a slight opening to kind of put some distance between Russia and China. That they were constantly in there saying that the biggest problem in U.S.-China relations is China's support of the war in Ukraine. How does the trade, And when I'm saying, it's not just tariffs, it's export restrictions, it's investment restrictions, it's yesterday we saw CATL issue 5 billion, 6 billion of shares in Hong Kong, and U.S. investors were not allowed to buy it. It wasn't clear to me why, but maybe because it's on the military list, I don't know. But in any case, how does this affect China's relationship with Russia? Does it just push them closer together?
Well, I think one of the reasons for China's continued strategic partnership with Russia has been the belief that they need a kind of a reliable partner, guarding at their back. They can't afford to be vulnerable in that direction as well. And so, the worse that U.S. China relations get, I think, the more there's that desire. And added to that, I think, is the recent effort by the Trump administration to pursue some kind of rapprochement with Russia, which has also made China somewhat nervous. And so they've also, I think, worked to try to shore up that partnership regarding, this is born of strategic necessity and a long-term benefit to China.
How did the Chinese look at the potential rapprochement between the United States and Russia? So we saw President Xi go up to Moscow for the celebration of the 80th anniversary of the victory against Germany. Was that done in part to kind of make sure that bridge is strong in the event there's a rapprochement between the U.S. and Russia?
I think absolutely it's part of that. I think that they bet that the U.S.-Russia rapprochement can't go that far. So that tempers, I think, some of the nervousness. But whenever one side of this triangle, I think, gets stronger, the other sides get a little bit worried, and so this is, I think, part of that effort. But might have happened anyway, right? And so this is continually something that they work toward.
Did the Chinese worry about getting? Chinese history has a lot of examples of the former Soviet Union doing in, so to speak, the Chinese Communist Party. Do they worry about that today? That Russia, obviously the successor state, is worried about the U.S. having a rapprochement with Russia and China being on the short end of the stick?
Well, I think there are a lot of lessons that they take from the Cold War history. This is potentially one of them. I think they also, are quite concerned and share this concern with Russia's leaders that they don't like a world in which the United States kind of retains the upper hand. And so, together, really, I think since the war in Yugoslavia, et cetera, and U.S. and NATO intervention there, have been interested in and talked explicitly about desiring a more multipolar order. And so there is a tactical element of this effort to shore up that relationship, but I think that it is premised in large part on these enduring kind of shared strategic interests in resisting what they would call kind of U.S. hegemonism or unilateralism.
Alison, so you've spent your life in, not in the cultural exchange between the United States and China. How has the downturn in the relationship affected that? And what can you think of, what can you tell people are areas where we can continue cooperation between the United States and China, which isn't crushed by this strategic competition?
So I always like to say the arts are the good news, even when there's a tremendous amount of bad news, especially domestically for the arts, with what's going on with the NEA, with grants rolling back. So what's happening now for the arts and culture environment in general in the US is a new backdrop that is affecting US involvement in international cultural exchange generally, not just with the US and China. The bright spots are there's still tremendous desire on behalf of institutions to keep things going. I mean, all of you can go down the street tomorrow, or no, they're closed on Wednesdays, but the Met has this incredible exhibition now of Chinese bronze that's been in the works in close collaboration with the Shanghai Museum. And that is going to continue touring afterwards. So those relationships are strong with the Met and Shanghai Museum. We have colleagues here from Yale China that are working on exchanges with bringing artists and residents to go to China and Chinese artists to come here for residencies. So a lot of the things that have always happened are continuing to happen. One of the other backdrop that always puts a pall on arts exchange are visas. Yeah. And the price of visas have gone up. O&P visas, which are the artist visas, now are in the thousands of dollars per artist. And with arts funding in the US being rolled back, institutions that typically brought artists from China and other countries as well simply can't afford the visas to get artists over here. So, and that's been going on since before Trump. So the challenges are there, but the institutions that have always been doing the work haven't cut ties yet on both sides.
Explain that. I didn't realize. So a visa for an artist is more expensive than a visa for a business person?
I don't know what business visas are, but P&O visas are at least $500 per visa, and then you need to do premium processing because the show must go on. There's a deadline, and previously you would file for artist visas around 3 to 6 months in advance. Now people aren't sure what the federal personnel cuts are going to do to the visa processing times. And so premium processing is between $2,800 to around $3,500 for premium processing. And that doesn't even guarantee you that it will happen at a certain deadline. And so and now the advice we're getting from lawyers who specialize in artist visas, not just China, but many countries say just do premium processing. That used to be a nice bonus if you had a little bit of extra time, and now they say, no, that's just the baseline. No matter what artist visa you're doing, do premium processing. So it's really challenging, and you are seeing, that's a huge deterrent. So Global Fest is a big global music festival that now happens at Lincoln Center every year. It used to be at Public Theater and other venues. And this year, there's been a huge decline in artists willing to come because they just can't take the risk of putting this commitment to a time frame to the US, knowing the visas might not come through. They'd be better served trying to tour Australia or Europe.
And they just can't come here on a B1?
It's not legal. If you are performing as a commercial artist, not commercial, if you are performing in a nonprofit festival or commercial and somebody's selling tickets, it has to be a P&O visa.
Andrew, let's go back to the tariffs and other things. There seemed to be a view in the U.S. government that China's economy was really weak, and it was a great time to actually put tariffs in place because they don't have the ability to kind of inoculate themselves against that. Is that true?
Not in my view. I mean, I think it's interesting because, you hear these conversations in D.C. where it's like, oh, the Chinese economy is weak, it's on its knees, so now's the perfect time, to kind of twist the knife and see if we can coerce them into, agreeing to some things. We want structural reform, et cetera. And then in the very next breath, people will say, but we don't want the economy to get too weak because then Xi Jinping will probably decide to invade Taiwan to distract everyone from the economic weakness. And so, we don't want it to be weak. We want it to be weak, but not too weak. Anyway, my view on that is everybody knows the Chinese economy has long-term structural issues that they've been dealing with really for, a decade plus now. And the economy is going to slow structurally as it kind of evolves. They have a productivity issue. They have a once-in-a-generation or even 100-year, they're undergoing a once-in-a-100-year property market realignment. And that's really, in my view, at the fundamental, heart of China's challenges right now. But when you put that in context and you say, well, they're undergoing this massive property market realignment, the fact that they're still seeing even positive growth is pretty impressive, right? So if you look at the most recent, we know the structural piece and challenges, and they are arguably being too slow to address those, but in my view, they are addressing them. But if you look at on a cyclical basis, the economy is stable, and the most recent data, industrial production was very strong. It's slowing, but still very solid. Consumption is picking up in some areas. It's either stable or picking up. So that's showing us that maybe household sentiment and consumer sentiment is actually improving in the face of the trade war. One of the best numbers last month of April, when the tariffs went on, were exports. So Chinese companies were able, the U.S. numbers were way down. They were down 20% year on year. But companies were able to find other places to sell their wares, and that's actually, obviously concerning to...
What the data has shown is a real shift.
Yes, exactly.
From the exports to the United States to the exports to Southeast Asia, Europe, and South America.
100%. Yeah. Well, and what I often talk about this as someone who owns a business, we talk about policy and what's the government going to do in the face of the trade war, and that matters obviously. But what I always tell people is, if you're a business and your biggest client becomes unreliable, or your biggest customer, you don't just throw up your hands and you say, well, it was a good ride. Let's close it up. You find ways to transship. Maybe you smuggle some stuff to the U.S. You find other clients or customers that will buy your goods. And so I think a lot of, just at the firm level, Chinese companies are being very, creative about how they react to the tariffs.
Jessica, I saw you I think I saw you scowl when he was joking about the Taiwan, that China's economy is going to weaken and Xi Jinping is going to attack Taiwan. I guess that's partly, did I see the scowl is one question. And then the other question is, you've written about protest in foreign relations, in China's conduct of foreign relations, et cetera. What's the tolerance within China? So if these tariffs remain high, and some places they can't redirect to Southeast Asia or Europe, and they're going to close. And there's going to be a real effect in Guangdong, in Fujian, in Zhejiang, Jiangsu, and Shanghai. Those are pretty wealthy places where people, we do protest. So both those questions together.
Great. Well, I think you did catch me. I was scowling because not only did they overestimate the weakness of China's economy, but they also then, in your telling, linked it to this, I would say at this point, a kind of myth or misinformation about the relationship between kind of domestic challenges and Chinese foreign policy, which, I've summarized some of the literature in an analysis in a foreign affairs article, and Taylor Fravel, another I think he's also a Pipper, has also written about this, basically showing that, in the history of Chinese foreign policy to date, there's actually no relationship between domestic challenges and more belligerent foreign policy, certainly not of the kind that leads to actual war. There may have been some saber rattling in the Mao era, but if anything, the relationship goes in the other direction, which is that they are more restrained when there are these challenges on the home front, with the caveat that if foreigners seem to be provoking them, they may lash out at that provocation. So I'm not saying that we can then take advantage of this because they're going to be more restrained, but there is that. And so that relationship flies in the face of this narrative that continues to circulate. I think, to your broader question, Steve, about how much pain can be endured in China, I mean, it's anybody's guess, but I imagine that it's quite a lot, and that, already there was reports of, factories saying, don't come back after the May holiday, and that not only, is there the kind of existing kind of coercive apparatus in which large-scale protests haven't been allowed in recent years or much more strictly controlled, they also have a very convenient target, which is the United States, for having caused all this pain. And so if anything, I think that the recent events have kind of validated the CCP's approach, right? And they're gearing up for a kind of a protracted struggle in which they expect to eventually prevail. And so I think that the idea that this would bring about, massive protests that would shake the regime is highly unlikely.
Where do the Chinese want to end up? So if you could sit with Xi Jinping and hear what he has said, so where do they want to end up in terms of their role in the world?
Well, you actually have sat with Xi Jinping, but from where I sit...
And his answer is different from what the U.S. government says it is, but okay.
Well, indeed, I think that I'm not sure that the Chinese have a better defined end state than the United States does. But what I see is them articulating is kind of a protracted struggle, in their words, in which eventually the United States will accept China as a legitimate power. And that eventually U.S. China relations might evolve into a state of some kind of peaceful coexistence But that this can only emerge after a long period of competition and struggle, because the United States won't otherwise sort of recognize that. And so I see this as a potentially workable, but it does again require some changes in the sense of first of all, I think it requires neither side to be determinedly focused on what we might call hegemony or supremacy or primacy in the world. And I thought there was actually an interesting line in the recent white paper on national security that the Chinese government put out, where they seem to reflect on the kind of the dangers of pursuing a hegemony. It stated that pursuing strength first and pursuing absolute safety will only lead to a security dilemma. And so I think that ultimately how this works out will depend on kind of the interaction of both countries as well as the input of the rest of the world. And we shall see. I think that this future still remains to be imagined. But changes unseen in a century, may yet deliver, a different kind of sensibility for defining success in absolute rather than relative terms. And that could, I think, lead to some form of coexistence that could be more constructive than destructive.
So you're in Washington, so you get to hear from experts more frequently than we do here in New York. When somebody says to you that Xi Jinping wants to impose Marxist-Leninist theory on the world, what do you say?
I scowl again. And then I turn to my book manuscript, which seeks to provide a different understanding of Chinese foreign policy. Look, I think that the Chinese Communist Party remains Marxist-Leninist in name, but there are many in China who are very skeptical that they remain true to those beliefs. And you only have to look at the Marxist student groups who have been crushed. And my colleague at Hopkins, Ho Feng Heng, says that the Chinese the United States and China should be better understood as an intercapitalist competition, given the way that they now run their economy. I think that there are certainly fragments of that language that they are, I think, loath to give up, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, even though there are, interestingly, leading scholars in China who say that they should really jettison that and embrace something else. That's part of why the search for Confucianism or other strands of thought that would provide a more legitimate framework for China to exercise leadership and governance itself politically. But that would be a big political change, obviously. And as we all know, that reform is one of the most dangerous things for to attempt, and so I don't expect any such changes. But all that is to say that it's really important that we read Chinese official rhetoric with heaping, I think, spoonful of salt, because a lot of it is there for domestic political consumption and continuity with a revolutionary past that they want to be seen as the rightful kind of inheritors and upholders of, even if it's not actually much of a guidepost for their decision making.
Alison, obviously the areas for cooperation are becoming more limited. Yours is still one which is still possible, though visas do make that more difficult. Are there other areas where you think we can still cooperate with China?
The one area of concern when you were talking about reading official rhetoric, the context in which it's given and when it's intended for a domestic readership versus actual statements of foreign policy, I mean, I think that's where the need for people that can actually read the tea leaves, shout out to Pippers, but also students and people able to spend time in China and understand things contextually, because when you take things out of context, they mean very different things and are often very wrong. So the huge drop that we saw of American students going to China after COVID is extremely concerning, because it's setting us up for, after our generation of us young folks up here, another further drop, which actually scares me more than some immediate things is that long-term impact. However, bright spots remain. So this year, the application rate for NYU Shanghai was higher than ever, even since pre-COVID numbers. So that's encouraging that the general climate of fear in the U.S. isn't
You're saying
entirely
that includes Americans.
It's specifically about Americans applying. So
because
NYU Shanghai
Chinese
is
also want to
50%.
go there, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So of the 25% that can be American, the application numbers were up this year, which is encouraging that there's an interest and a desire to go. Once people are over there, obviously, and we all know this in this room, there's tremendous range for what you can do. I heard one story of a student at NYU Shanghai who was not doing so well in his Chinese class. Perhaps academic learning was not for him. So he just took 3 months off and bicycled from Shanghai to Xi'an and learned Chinese by chatting with fruit sellers. And I'm sure many of us in this room had those kinds of experiences over the last couple decades, and that's so transformative, and that's the kind of contextual experience that makes such a difference long term. So that, it's anecdotal and it's one example, but the fact that those are still happening, I think given what you hear, the rhetoric, certainly what I hear at UNC Chapel Hill, where until last fall's, reduction from a level 3 to a level 2, warning from the State Department, students weren't allowed to go there. There was so much fear for American students going there. So that feels like the temperature is, there are bright spots where not all parents and school administrators are saying stay away. And funders are, study abroad programs and other organizations that are funding that are still there and are still supporting it. So one of the bright spots remain opportunities for study abroad and programs like NYU Shanghai, despite coming under fire, a lot of them.
Are you optimistic, Jessica, also about the return of Americans to China?
I will say
It's a good view. I'm happy to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
Grabbing at everything we can to be optimistic about.
Yes, I mean, I'm aware of legislation that might be working its way through the system that would put all of this in jeopardy. And even if it doesn't pass, for my own planning for a trip to China this summer to participate in a dialogue organized by Peking University and to give a guest lecture at Fudan's University Summer School. Both of those, I need to now work through the university system, their export control office, and in both cases, those universities have been, while I haven't been told you cannot do it, they have said those have military affiliations, and I'm like, okay, well. And so, I mean, I worry that we are very much going to be cutting off our ability to understand what is even happening in China. I spoke with another China expert at a prominent think tank who said that actually speaking with Chinese companies that are on the entity list is critical for us to understand how effective these are in the first place. And if you don't understand what's happening on the other side, we're making policy blind. So I really worry about the well-intentioned efforts by universities and other entities to comply with what they understand to be the spirit of the concern emanating from not just the administration, but especially Capitol Hill, but without any real sense of the damage to our short and long-term capacity to understand, even if you want to describe it as our most important competitor.
Now, you're a private university.
Yes.
For state universities, it's much, much tougher.
Indeed.
Yeah, UNC. Yeah,
When you go to China, do you have to do long reports and explain what you're doing and why you're doing it and make sure you're not violating export controls? It's hard to imagine social scientists violate export controls.
We do have to bring the burner laptops and cell phones when we go. No reports as of yet with the state, UNC state system. The other thing we're seeing, which feels like a flip from how I used to do arts and cultural exchange in China 20 years ago, is things are still happening. People are just being a bit more quiet about them. So there are China festivals, China weeks, themes about China that are in the works for the next couple years. And some of those art centers say, we're going to talk about it after it happens. We're not going to try and do a big press junket beforehand. We're not, we'll advertise to sell tickets once it gets closer. But in the preparation, we're being much more DDL, much more under the radar about it, which is a lot of how some of the projects we used to do with my company, Ping Pong Productions, 15 and 20 years ago, where you could still do it, you get all the performance permits, you'd get all the official acceptance and approvals, but you wouldn't be very loud until after it happened. And that's exactly what we're seeing here in the US now with projects with China. The sensitivity is much more coming here than going there.
Andrew, one of the great people-to-people exchanges is investment. It was the beginning of my career investing in China, and I believed that the folks we invested with became a real pillar of constructive U.S.-China relations. They were more pro-U.S. than the average Chinese. They really became more internationalists and played a positive role in U.S.-China relations for many years. Where are we going to end up in the investment area? Again, I said this CATL issue, I didn't quite understand what happened, but talk about both CATL and then the Invest in America memorandum that came out about 2 months ago.
Yeah, it doesn't look good. I mean, I'm pretty pessimistic on that one. I mean, already, when we started our business 8 years ago, our entire business was helping foreign companies, to invest more, to understand policy, align with policy so that they could, make successful investments. And that's just not happening.
I mean, U.S. companies investing in
U.S. companies, other
and
foreign
Chinese companies investing here.
We don't do that side of it. We helped American companies and other foreign companies into China. But now, if anything, people are holding steady. Some are, scaling back. A lot of investments that were approved for 4 or 5 years but put on hold during COVID, people are just walking away from. And so I'm pretty pessimistic on U.S. companies certainly investing in China. There's some exceptions. Some of the consumer companies are still believe in the consumption story. Meanwhile, all the European companies we talk to are having these amazing meetings with He Feng. They're saying he is so welcoming, he's on point on his briefing book, going off script with them, and they're chomping at the bit to get in and take advantage of it. So I'm very...
So what's causing, the U.S. companies are doing because of political pressure or because they just see that the Chinese are going to retaliate at some point and they're not going to have a business? What's causing it on the U.S. side?
I think it's a combination of, American executives don't want to go there. So it's hard to, have a foreign team growing the business. And basically since COVID, kind of speaking about people to people, what we've really seen is like headquarters government affairs teams versus China, the government affairs teams in China no longer trust each other in the same company. They're literally living in different information ecosystems. It's like Republicans and Democrats. Like some of the services we provide are to send our Chinese GR teams that work with the Chinese governments, stories from the Wall Street Journal so that they know what their bosses in DC are reading. It's really been a breakdown. So part of it's people don't want to go. That's kind of the COVID hangover. Part of it's the economy's not doing well, so investment decisions are, scarcer. And there's been a sort of risk-reward adjustment where the rewards, the growth is going down, right? It's growing more slowly, and the risks have gone up. So the risk-adjusted return for a lot of companies doesn't make sense. And then you throw in the geopolitics on top of it, and companies are just very reticent to expand their footprint in China these days. I think also we are going to see almost certainly more restrictions from the Trump administration and probably successive administrations on American FDI investment into China, certainly Chinese investment into the U.S., and likely more and more portfolio investment. I think we mentioned the military linked. It seems to me that the Trump administration is trying to find a logic not only to keep U.S. investors from investing in new companies, but to potentially even delist the companies that are currently listed on U.S. exchanges by saying they're all linked to the U.S. military, which would make them uninvestable for American asset managers.
That's really cheering me up.
Sorry.
President Trump has said he wants Chinese companies to invest in the United States. So you're saying that they're not going to follow the president?
Well, I will say, you know, President Trump is the only person in D.C. who thinks it's a good idea for Chinese companies to be investing more in the U.S., but he might also be the one person who can kind of bring at least the Republican Party along with him on that idea. So I actually don't count it out as like, I personally would love to have Chinese EVs being made in the US. Those cars are amazing and cheap, and we should be driving them, personal opinion. But I think, you know, even if Trump did that, does that kind of policy extend beyond a Trump administration, which is what Chinese companies are going to be thinking? And, you know, by the time you get an investment online, Trump's going to be out of the White House. So,
Yep.
you know, there's a much bigger calculus for them.
Yeah, interesting, partly because I'm an eternal optimist. I guess you can't work on China for 50 years and be anything but an eternal optimist. But you know, I've always been a strong supporter of bilateral investment. I think because it builds the people-to-people ties, and it's generally been very profitable for long lists of companies on both sides. So in a conversation actually yesterday with a Trump person in Washington, he said, you know, I said there is this opposition across the board. And he said, it was interesting, he used the word uniparty, the uni-party. So he said, we need to oppose the uni-party. And I kind of said, what do you mean? He says, well, there's the Democrats and Republicans who won't ask the right questions about the benefits that accrue to Americans from non-national security investment. So, you know, the Republicans, they all say, well, this is not a good idea. But nobody is asking the right question. And he says, but then he, by the way, was saying, and President Trump, he can't force the Democratic side, but he can force the Republican side, that if he decides this is something that's good for America. So if the Chinese are creating hundreds of thousands of jobs in America through their investment, and President Trump thinks it's the idea, then the uniparty, you know, the Republican side will go along with it. Then to your question, well, what is the next, you know, it takes you a long time to build stuff. And what does the next administration do? But what do we're painting a somewhat bleak picture. So Jessica, what do we do? You've been in government. What's your prescription?
Well, I think first on this issue, I actually don't think it's quite as bleak. I mean, I don't think it's just President Trump. I have heard others who are Republican affiliated or Democratic affiliated who welcome this kind of, frankly, technology transfer into the United States of, you know, in the renewable energy kind of supply chain. Of course, there are a lot of headwinds, and I think one of the biggest is whether or not Chinese companies would even want to do so, given the political environment, including at the state and local level. But I think more broadly, we're in a time of reevaluation. And so I actually think that some things that might not have been thinkable before are you know, the Overton window is wider. And so it is a challenging time, to be sure, to be saying anything. But I also think that some of the quiet thinking could be laid for a more a durable equilibrium in the future as the United States no longer is quite as I don't know, I can't nostalgically attached to a past position. That's not to say that I welcome all of the ways in which the United States has repudiated international institutions or alienated allies. I mean, right now the United States is viewed more unfavorably apparently in Canada than China is, and so that's saying a lot. And so I'm not saying that the destruction will have been worth it, but I think at least in the bilateral space, as we remake American foreign policy, different possibilities open up. And so if we can survive, and I say that as somebody based at a university, and I think that there will be opportunities in the future. And what's important now is to create a template or potential pathways forward that are, I think, more grounded in the realities than in some of these kind of easy broad brush narratives that have not been very helpful for both harnessing the benefits, but mitigating the risks of in various forms of involvement with China.
Alison, you're in the people-to-people area. What should we be doing so we can? help the American people.
I would agree with that. This is in some ways a time of much quieter foundation laying to keep ties that exist, keep the existing ones strong. So mentioned some of them. A lot of arts institutions and education institutions are continuing to do things. They're just doing them more quietly. And what that allows is when there is a shift, when there is presumably some moment to do more, it's not starting from scratch, that there's a level of preservation that needs to happen right now, just a treading water until, but the lean into the bright spots, a fellowship that sends 25 students a semester from UNC to Asia hasn't been able to send any of them to mainland China since COVID, and this year finally they're sending 5. So again, like wherever there are bright spots and baby steps that foundations are funding student exchange, where arts institutions are funding either artist exchange on a J visa because they're not performing, they're just doing research, or to perform in major festivals or to do exhibits like the bronze one at the Met, those keep it at least it's sort of the opportunity for an and. We're all hearing the headlines that are fear-mongering. We're all seeing serious causes for concern, and that's not the only story. So to where are all the ways we can make sure that there's that and in the story, I think keeps catastrophizing and also helps remind that there might be other ways that this relationship can grow. Because again, when you get beyond some of the when you get to people conversation, I have yet to talk to any of the artists on both sides that I've ever worked with that don't want to continue the projects, despite everything that's going on. I have even colleagues in the Ministry of Culture 2 years ago when I was there for meetings, and they used to be at the Chinese consulate in Norway or in Australia. Now they're back in Beijing in higher positions. Their first question was, what can we do? What students can we bring over? What performances? And in the pendulum swing right now, it's going to go back to more traditional things, orchestras, you know, the safe old guard of exchanges that we're familiar with, and that's fine, like keep that going. But to see Chinese contemporary dance companies a year ago won the Silver Lion at the Venice Biennale, which is one of the highest awards internationally for contemporary dance, went to a Chinese dance company. There's an and that needs to be reminded in the midst of some of the fear that is louder in the room, but is not the only voice.
I'm trying to think, who wrote the letter to the Kennedy Center for having a performance
The National Ballet of
by
China,
the Chinese
Molinar.
National.
The Molinar,
Right.
yeah.
How do you respond to that? In other words, the Chinese system, the American system are different. You know, this is, you decide what you want to do. It's free. The Chinese system, the cultural system is state-directed. So how do you, you know, when you invite them here to the United States, are you basically allowing them to propagate a false narrative?
And that goes back to needing people that have understood what a ballet performance is and to contextualize it. And I think my colleagues at the Kennedy Center do really responsible presenting. You don't just kind of throw something up on stage without context, without their education department doing programming with schools, without their press and media telling stories about the history of the National Ballet of China and what that actually means. That, again, back to the point of, is Xi Jinping's goal to propagate Marxist socialist thought, you know, through the ballet, and how do you counter that narrative? Again, that's where there's work to be done. Sometimes, not always. I don't know about that letter, but you don't respond.
Andrew, what would you do?
Well, a couple of things. I try to tell policymakers 2 things, which is grow up.
Their face? How does that go?
And stop the ideological BS. And what I mean by grow up is like, I just, you know, we've got a competitor. Let's just compete. We don't, I mean, you see this all the time in DC, you know, pearl clutching when you find that a certain cultural group or other entity is linked to the CCP. Yes, everything is linked to the CCP. Let's just understand that and accept it as a, you know, reality of China. So what I mean is, and that's linked to the ideological piece. To me, you know, casting everything in ideological terms, is it a Marxist-Leninist system that we have to defeat, you know, from the face of the earth, is not helpful. When instead, if we just look at China trying to defend its interests, trying to advance its interests, and we're doing the same thing, and understand that they're a very strong competitor and just go compete against them, it just casts the entire relationship in a different light. And I'm totally fine and support American policymakers who want to compete against China, even in areas where they want to trip China up. But casting it because we have to end Xi Jinping's vision of, retaking Taiwan and, overtaking the entire world becomes unhelpful. And then the space for conversation around policy just shrinks to where there are no options that can be offered that are outside the mind hive of, DC policymakers.
Can I offer something too, which is that we've done a lot of sort of self-criticism, right, of American foreign policy. I mean, this is our government. This is a democracy. We can do so. But I think this is a moment in which the Chinese government has a lot of opportunities to do things a little bit differently in ways that might reassure the world and its neighbors that they aren't quite so, coercive or bent on, might equals right. And I think that it will be really interesting to watch whether they take those paths or not, whether that's in terms of the economy or in the way they conduct their foreign policy. So I just want to make sure that we aren't just sort of giving them a pass and say, we all have to figure it out over here. So I just want to offer that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the ways they do that is by trying to export soft power through arts and culture, and by saying, oh no, we're also very innovative and we're also very free thinking and we cultivate creativity. And again, there's nuance there and it depends. You are seeing a rollback. Historically, the embassy and the consulates would do things like rent out the Coke Theater and put on big extravaganzas, sort of da and and then give away all the tickets because no one wanted to buy it. But then when some younger and more contemporary artists started getting traction and would be invited by festivals here and invited by presenters and producers, suddenly they didn't have to foot the bill and they realized, wait a minute, there's a real demand for contemporary culture. It in some ways helped a lot of civil society with the arts in China because they realized there was a real international market for it that also presented a very contemporary, creative face of the culture. Some of that, I don't think it's an official policy. I think it's people being careful again, because when things start to shift, then you start to see middle management not wanting to accidentally step over a line, so they will be less likely to send this modern dance company to Edinburgh or to Paris or to the US, as opposed, not because they've been told not to, but because they're sort of shrinking back. But I think one way that internal reflection of showing a different side, has historically, arts and culture has been used in that way as well. Yeah.
I always love at the end of many meetings with Chinese officials, they will ask, well, what should we do? It's quite lovely. They say, well, you're the National Committee on U.S. China. What should we do? And I said, you want the full list? So, and then it's interesting. So, because again, what Jessica said, we're always critical of what the U.S. is doing, but you got to, when you're meeting with the Chinese, I say, well, first of all, take down the firewall. The most recent trip, my VPN didn't work, and it was a nightmare. I mean, I had to see everything. My eyes are going. I have to see everything on my little phone because I had an international plane. I mean, it was terrible. I said, invite back expelled journalists. Reduce restrictions on what Americans can research when they're in China. Agree with the Americans on a definition of what's national security. You securitize everything. Everything is national security. Now the Americans have learned from you, and we're securitizing everything, but you started it. So I go through this whole long list, and the response is always, we know you're speaking from the view that you want good U.S.-China relations, which means we're not going to do it. But still, one day, on the expulsion of journalists, I said, just invite them back. And if a journalist goes out to the provinces, tell the local gonganju, the local paichuso, don't invite them for tea. It's a bad thing. You're going to get worse coverage for this. And you go. It's funny. I always have the sense that the people I'm meeting with agree with me. But then it doesn't happen. I'm the optimist. It will happen one day. It will surely happen one day. Are we supposed to have audience questions? Yes. So I have way exceeded my time. But people with hands up. We got Keith in the front and then somebody in the back in the tie. You need to, because they need to hear it online.
More people online? Do you want to get them first?
You're good.
I was interested in what you said about how they're rolling out the red carpet for the European business community and how you're helping Americans get into China. I was curious about is what is the pitch in 2025? Are they dangling the promise of this domestic marketplace for foreign entrants, or are they being honest about their interest in building their own low-cost manufacturing export power beyond what it already is? What is the reality, and what are they pitching?
Yeah, I mean, so, it's been the year of FDI for 3 years in a row now. So that, they, just after COVID, these officials were having the same very, great meetings with American companies to get them back investing again. Now, of course, they stepped on their own feet by things like the Minsk Group and the Bain investigations and all those things. So I think there is a genuine desire to get more investment because they need it from the foreign investment community, from the foreign business community. And now it's just, there's obviously been a chill with the Americans. And so they're trying to take advantage of the fact that we don't just have a trade war with China, but we have a trade war with everyone to try to see if they can get some of those companies to come. Now, a lot of those governments from Europe don't necessarily want it to happen, right? But the companies are interested in doing it, many of them. So I think the sell from China is, listen, now's the time to make a deal. We're obviously there's spin and this is not fully true, but we're now the reliable partner. We're open to investment. We'll see what kind of tax deals and other things, the kind of deals that went through in the 80s and 90s. And so, yeah, there's an absolute pitch, like, we're open, we're ready, we're here. And by the way, the U.S. is totally erratic, so wouldn't you rather try to, create some stability with us? And I think that resonates with a lot of European companies.
To sell? What are they offering, is my question.
What do you mean? Like,
What does China have to offer, other than a very difficult place to do business?
okay.
How do you make money there?
Well, a lot of these European companies, like, China is still their biggest market, right? And so, and they are, if you're not growing in China, for a lot of these companies, you're not growing anywhere. So that's a good, it is a tough sell in that the economy's still not great, geopolitics isn't great. But if you're a European company and you're looking out at the rest of the world, what are your other options? So, yeah, I guess the answer really is they're selling, we're your least bad option.
In this meeting that we had with Xi Jinping, 38 people, all of who have very successful businesses in China. And there was one American who spoke, the CEO of FedEx, and there was the chairman of Mercedes-Benz, which is investing hundreds of millions in China this year. They didn't speak, but BMW was there, which is investing. And this is for the Chinese market. They're not exporting from China. They may export some to Europe, but I think that's going to become problematic going forward. SK Hynix was there and spoke. Hitachi was there and spoke. Olivier, the CEO of Sanofi, was there and spoke and talked about the breakthroughs that they're having in China in terms of research and the ability to sell more pharmaceuticals in China. So it was very. Oh, and then the CEO of Saudi Aramco, who's also investing hundreds of billions in China. So he was making President Xi was making the statement. All right, you U.S. guys, we're ready. We're going elsewhere if you guys don't want to be here. But he also said in the course of his conversation, foreign investment has been one of the pillars of Chinese success that we've been able to develop in part because of foreign investment. And it's a great market. We hope you stay.
It's a tough sell.
There's Nancy.
Someone with
Is
a
that
mic in the
Nancy?
back.
I can. Yeah, there you are.
There's a guy
There's
behind
somebody
with the
who
mic.
gave the mic, and then Nancy. Go ahead. I can't tell who that is.
Hi, my name is Aaron Romagna. I was a Schwarzman Scholar in 2018, 2019. I wanted to ask, anytime China's economy comes up these days, including in this panel, it seems like it's almost that people can see whatever they want to see, right? If you're a bear, you have evidence to back that up, and if you're a bull, you have evidence to back that up. And that was true before Liberation Day tariffs, and it's also true after Liberation Day tariffs. You know, if you're an optimist, you can say tariffs are exactly the nudge China needed to seek other export markets and boost domestic consumption and so forth, right? So for those of us who are kind of avid watchers of Chinese economy, what signal should we be looking for, right, rather than asking you to predict what will happen, what signal should we be looking for to see which of those two comes out to be the case?
Great question, and you're 100% right. But also that, in my view, it is true that China is always has strengths in the economy and always has weaknesses. So you can kind of build whatever story you want. And just like people say in the political side, China's not 4 foot tall and it's not 10 feet tall. It's 5'7", and we should treat it as such. Same with the economy. It's not dominating the world. It's not imploding. It's somewhere in the middle. It's meddling through. I'm a policy analyst, so I watch what the government does. Like, is the PBOC reacting? What, is there fiscal policy reform? What is the State Council doing? Where are they focusing their energy in terms of, supplying more credit to whatever it is, science and technology? Or, are they supporting exporters? So I watch what we call the Chinese government's reaction function. That the government can be wrong and misdiagnose things, but at least for me, that tells me what the Chinese government thinks is going right and going wrong.
Nancy. And then I think.
Thank you. Thinking of Joe Nye's passing recently and how he coined soft power, I guess I'm really struggling with if we're still thinking in the old frame of mind, even around grassroots relationship building, and should we think about the evolution of what soft power looks like? And I couple that also with the fury around the banning potentially of TikTok. I haven't seen more people upset with our US government than when that happened. And I just trying to think, I don't know if we're being fresh enough on how we're thinking about the evolution of soft power, and I wonder if you have any great ideas.
I was going to ask you what your fresh idea is, or your...
No, I don't have it.
I don't like the idea of instrumentalizing the arts. So I think the idea of soft power in that term could be an effect, but it should never be the intention. There are unbelievable artists working in China. There are unbelievable artists working in the US. There's no reason not to share those. And the outcome might be a changed perception of the respective countries. But the role of, and I think that's an important outcome, but usually when a government instrumentalizes it, it fails. Nobody buys a ticket to the Coke theater extravaganzas and they give them all away for free. That was intentionally trying to, instrumentalize the arts to show something, and it didn't work. Whereas when an artist has something really powerful to say and it starts getting invited to festivals, suddenly audiences look up and say, wait, China has really avant-garde modern dance, and that view of China has to get a little bit bigger to make room for that. So I think that's why a lot of what concerns me now is more in our domestic ecology for the arts is so concerning, of the ripple effects that will have for international exchange, not again because of the intention for it, but because of we need to foster great art, full stop. That's what culture is. That's how, when you build a brand, it's from the inside out. It's what you're known for. And what does the US want to be known for? It would be nice if we were known a little more for cultural, artistic things than some of the other aspects that we're currently known for. I think that TikTok and social media is obviously an invaluable tool for sharing the creativity that is out there. It's also a tool for sharing a lot of garbage and beautiful cat videos. But the outrage about TikTok and then the brief moment where everyone shifted to Xiaohongshu was incredible. I mean, the feedback that everybody saw of, wait a minute, you've been telling me this, and now I'm seeing this, and that cognitive dissonance made room for more of the and. So I think that soft power as an instrumentalization doesn't work. You get a lot of hypocrisy, you get a lot of bad art, but if there's investment in creativity and innovation domestically, and then the ability to share that through markets, through exchange, then there's meaningful interaction and connection.
Great. So at the end, right there, yeah.
Thank you. Ali Mazzara, Geneva Global, LLC. It's sort of building off that question on soft power. I went to something at an Italian-American Columbus citizens group last year, and before the program started, these women were talking about their trips to China. Some had already gone. They were middle class, Italian-American background, and some were heading out there. And I was a fly on the wall. They were so positive about their trip to China, what they saw, how impressed they were with China. And I feel like we're not capitalizing on a group of people, and I don't mean Italian, I mean a group of people who might be very pro-China, that we're just not catching that. Is there any way that we could leverage interest in people who are just sort of quote-unquote average people but are interested in China and impressed by China?
I'll just offer some thoughts. This isn't really my area, but I think it's a tricky one because, I mean, like, speaking of the next generation, how are younger people, promoting things, their ideas? It's TikTok, it's short videos, it's like influencers. I do think, I mean, people may have seen the iShowSpeed, live stream from China, which I felt was like on a level of the Xiaohongshu, episode. Like, it showed incredible things about China to millions of people who would never have otherwise tuned in. It's tricky though, because then there truly are a lot of like foreigners almost propagandizing about China, about their trips to China. So it can be, my thinking would be, let's let the young people figure this out and educate us about it. But then you have the question about the propagandizing.
Well, that's why I would actually, I don't want to think about it as how do we capitalize on people who might be pro-China, because I don't think that's actually our goal. I don't think it's that binary. It's the and. There's all this concern that we've been talking about that are very real, and there's all these other things going on that are not getting as much attention. So I think the fact that they had such a brilliant time isn't because now they're pro-China and all the negative or risks are gone. I think it's just that they didn't hear or see any of the positive side to balance that and create a fuller picture. So I think what we're talking about when we talk about people to people, when we talk about exchange, when we talk about the PIP's purpose of creating more nuance and discussion, it's not pro or anti one or the other. Like, throw the binaries out, talk about outdated modes of thinking. It's the more nuanced wholeness of the story, and that both can exist.
Natai, the gentleman in the white jacket. David?
Alakash, Asia Society. I'm going to commit the crime of asking a question to the moderator of the panel.
He'll be so disappointed.
Because
it's a crime.
I cannot resist but to ricochet back on Stephen Orlins the question that you asked to Jessica Chen Weiss, as you dangled this nugget in front of us and then didn't let us nibble. Based on your meetings with Xi Jinping and other officials, what is your view of the biggest question of the panel, which is, what does China want in the largest sense in the future? Specifically, is your impression that it wants to reshape the world, change the major institutions that run it, as perhaps Putin does, or to play within the existing system which benefited it so much and not to rock the boat?
Based on my conversation or based on my 50 years of dealing with China?
Both.
Yes.
But specifically, what
China
does she say?
wants to be able to deal with its soon to be 1.45 billion people. To the extent that international institutions affect their ability to deal with those people, they care. And they don't want the international system to interfere in China. And then, we don't have time, but obviously Taiwan is fundamental to their view of what they want from the international system. To the extent that a country or an international institution or anyone else interferes in that, they will oppose it and they will do virtually anything. But ultimately, the Chinese Communist Party wants to rule China forever, forever. And to the extent that people or institutions or states interfere in that, they're going to react strongly. But I don't think they will have any real view that they need to reshape international institutions. They need to make sure those institutions don't interfere in China. And that's kind of what it's about. But they're not, that's why I asked Jessica the question about, do they want to impose Marxist-Leninism on the rest of the world, which people in the United States believe they do. I don't think so. Other, right here, you got a broken arm, so we'll give you.
Thank you very much. My name is Christian, and thank you everybody for your thoughts. I already feel smarter than yesterday. Let me ask you two questions, one to Andrew, one to Jessica. Andrew, how do you think may local government debt and the decline in local revenue from land sales impact global markets and potentially U.S. China economic relations? That's question number one. And to Jessica, I was wondering on the Chinese foreign policy has evolved over the last few years, right? From being very assertive, war warrior type of diplomacy to now more of a tactical retreat. Do you think that that's a genuine shift in policy from Beijing, or that's just simply a tactical adjustment? Thank you.
I can answer the local government debt thing quickly. Obviously impacting China's economy. It's one of the biggest drags on the economy outside, consumer sentiment and the property market, which are the two biggest. It's obviously related to the property market because local governments get a lot of their revenue from land. Fundamentally, Beijing is going to have to bail out the local governments. If it doesn't, one of them is going to default, and then they're all going to default, and it's going to be a disaster. And so the way I read it is that they understand fiscal reform is the least sexy but most important reform they need to make, and they're inching their way towards it. You see the central government leveraging its balance sheet more and more and more to sort of backstop the riskiest parts of the debt, of local government debt, and to do more investment through the central balance sheet. You see people coming up with logics for a bailout like, hey, maybe we just pay all the local governments back for COVID because they didn't do that on their own. We told them they had to do it. So some interesting ideas coming around. Ultimately, it's going to be all of that has to go on the central government's balance sheet. So it's just it's going to happen. It's a question of how quickly they decide and how messy it is.
To your question about warfare diplomacy, I think the Chinese government has always been quite strategic in how it has managed both popular as well as sort of official forms of nationalism. And I think that spike that we saw was really, in part, a tactic used to push back against a lot of the finger pointing that peaked with COVID and the concerns about COVID origins. So we could certainly see it come back. But I think they're capable of a whole kind of spectrum of different ways of speaking diplomatically. So in recent months, Wang Yi has been seen as sort of like the gentleman and quite reassuring in comparison to speeches by some of American elected officials. And so I think this is not a sort of a secular shift where it's like, oh, Chinese nationalism is on the rise and it's here to stay. I think it does modulate with the government's diplomatic objectives and how it sees the strategic landscape.
Last question, David. We need a microphone right here.
I thought I heard you say something, Jessica, and so I just wanted to follow up. I thought you said that China sees that if it is expresses or is perceived as being hegemonic, that it will work negatively towards it and will enhance its insecurity, which sounds very Gorbachev, right? It sounds very much like China's taking the message, an international message that says if you're, that you don't get a better world by both sides trying to strengthen themselves and be aggressive, but that in fact that creates insecurity, which goes back to the Gorbachev era. And so I wonder if I heard you correctly, Just to follow up on that, the same question about, in your book, are you going to talk about the fact that there's a strong feeling in America that Xi Jinping is being driven by Marxism-Leninism in his foreign policy? And that's a fairly dominant view. We've heard it in New York, and I'm sure you've heard it in D.C. So I would just want to follow up on that.
Thanks. You did hear me correctly. You did hear me correctly. I think there are, of course, elements of Chinese rhetoric and planning that do seek to not just lead, but potentially dominate in certain advanced technologies. And so I'm not saying that there is one holistic picture of a China that doesn't seek that kind of advantage. But it suggests to me that there is nuance there and variation across domains, and that if this is a broader, the emergence of a kind of a strategic recognition and not just kind of a deceitful reassurance, that's something to build upon potentially. I don't dismiss the role of ideology at all. Certainly, I think the party maintains a very Leninist system and an attachment to preserving Communist Party rule in China indefinitely. But that's different from suggesting that you can look to the trappings of that ideology as a blueprint for the future that China seeks, which involves the dissolution of state boundaries, which would be very much at odds with their desire for non-interference in their internal affairs. So I think that there are internal, if you will, contradictions in Chinese rhetoric, and it's really important to notice not just the ones that seem to portray this picture of China, and to recognize that they are often implicated by other strands that make it very difficult to decipher exactly where China is going. So in general, my recommendation is for a greater degree of humility and uncertainty as to what exactly China wants in the world, and that it will be interactive and adaptive, opportunistic as well. But that just means that what we do today and the plans that we set out here in the United States or our allies and partners also potentially will implicate China's trajectory as well, as they try to find their best way forward as well in a shifting world.
Our panelists today are a testimony to the brilliance of the staff of the National Committee who selected such fabulous people. So, 你办事我放心. Thank you all for joining us.
Yay. Thanks, Steve.
That was great fun.